Theodore Ashby had a rule: never trust anyone who smiled too quickly. It had served him well for 38 years. It had kept him from bad investments, worse friendships, and 3 near engagements that, in hindsight, would have ended with his signature on a very expensive piece of paper. He'd built Ashby Capital from a cramped studio apartment in Portland with a laptop and a phone that kept dropping calls, and now he owned the top 2 floors of a building in downtown Seattle that had his name on it in steel letters, each one 4 feet tall. So yes, he could afford to be suspicious. What he could not afford, apparently, was good help. Mr. Ashby. His assistant, a meticulous young man named Preston, who owned more pocket squares than Theodore owned regrets, appeared in the doorway of his office without knocking. He'd learned not to knock. Knocking wasted 2 seconds. The agency sent 3 candidates for the personal coordinator position. They're waiting in the lobby. What city are you watching from? Theodore muttered to himself, which was something he'd started doing lately, narrating his own life like it was a documentary nobody had asked for. He set down his coffee. Send them up one at a time. The job posting had been Preston's idea. Theodore traveled 11 months out of 12. His penthouse at the Hargrove Grand, Seattle's most quietly expensive residential hotel, had started to feel like a storage unit with a view. What he needed, Preston had explained with the patience of a man defusing a bomb, was someone to manage the personal side of things. Someone who could coordinate with his housekeeper, his chef, his trainer, and the rotating cast of vendors and contractors who cycled through his life. Someone detail-oriented, discreet, and capable of remaining calm when Theodore Ashby walked into a room. That last quality, Preston had noted carefully, was perhaps the most difficult to find. The first candidate was a woman named Vivienne, who arrived in 4-inch heels, slid her resume across the desk like it was a contract already signed, and spent the first 3 minutes describing her previous employer, a tech founder in San Francisco, as sweet but a little lost without me. Theodore thanked her for coming. The second was a man named Briggs, who seemed to genuinely believe the interview was going well right up until Theodore asked him to describe a time he'd managed a crisis. Briggs mentioned a delay with a flower delivery. Theodore thanked him for coming. The third one was late. Not terribly late, 7 minutes, but Theodore had been watching the clock since minute 4, and by the time the elevator doors opened and he heard Preston say something in the lobby, his decision was already half made. Then the third candidate walked in. She looked like she'd taken the stairs, which, as it turned out, she had because the elevator had been held on the lobby level by a catering delivery and she hadn't wanted to wait. She was carrying a canvas tote bag instead of a briefcase. Her blazer was the kind you could buy at a department store on sale, and she had a smudge of what appeared to be ink on the side of her left hand. She noticed him noticing it. "Pen exploded on the bus," she said. "I tried to get it off in the lobby bathroom, but the soap dispenser was empty." She said it matter-of-factly, without embarrassment, like it was just data. "I'm Harriet Bloom. I'm 7 minutes late and I apologize for that. The elevator situation was outside my control. Being unprepared for it was not." Theodore looked at her for a moment. "Sit down," he said. Her name was Harriet Bloom. She was 29. She'd spent 4 years working logistics for a nonprofit that coordinated emergency housing in 3 Pacific Northwest counties, which meant she had managed budgets, contractors, city officials, and people in crisis, sometimes all 4 simultaneously, sometimes at 2 in the morning. She had left 6 months ago when the organization lost its primary funding source, and had spent the time since doing freelance coordination work for small businesses and one very disorganized family in Bellevue who, she said, needed someone to turn chaos into a calendar. She did not smile quickly. She answered his questions with the economy of someone who had learned that words were most useful when they carried weight. He hired her on the spot. What Theodore did not anticipate was that this would annoy nearly everyone else in his life. Hargrove Grand occupied a full city block 2 streets from the waterfront. The residential floors were on the upper levels, 12 units total, each one larger than most houses in the zip code. The building had a private dining room. A concierge named Morris, who had worked there for 22 years, and remembered the name of every resident's dog, and a kitchen staff that operated like a small brigade. Theodore owned the penthouse. He had, at various points over the past 2 years, also been linked romantically to 3 women who moved in his professional and social circles. All 3 had, to varying degrees, decided that this adjacency to him, proximity to the Ashby name, the Ashby accounts, the Ashby world, was something worth protecting. Veronica Dale was the most polished of the three. She was 41, ran a wealth management firm, and wore the kind of tailored suits that looked effortless until you noticed the seams. She had appeared on 2 magazine covers and mentioned both of them to Theodore within the first week of meeting him. Melanie Croft was younger, 34, and had the particular talent of making every room believe she was its most beloved occupant. She posted to social media with the precision of a military campaign. She called it sharing. Theodore called it something else. The third was Diane Forsyth. She was quiet in the way that very calculating people are sometimes quiet, conserving energy, watching exits. She worked in real estate and had twice shown Theodore properties he hadn't asked to see, then managed to make it seem like his idea. None of them had been told the other two existed in any meaningful capacity. All three found out in the same week that Harriet Bloom had been hired. Veronica called it interesting. Melanie posted a story that was very clearly about the situation without naming names, captioned with the phrase, "Some people mistake access for intimacy." Diane showed up at the Hargrove Grand lobby with a bottle of wine she described as a housewarming gift, and then spent 40 minutes in the residential lounge, trying to ask Morris, very casually, what the new coordinator was like. Morris said she seemed very competent. Diane finished her wine alone. The test was Preston's idea, which meant Theodore took credit for it. He'd been thinking, he explained to Preston over lunch one Tuesday, about the operational question of trust. How do you know what someone will do with resources before you give them resources? You cannot, Preston said, simply watch and wait. You could be waiting for years. Sometimes you needed to create conditions. What if, Preston said carefully, you gave each of them a budget, not a work budget, a personal one, a generous one, and just watched? Theodore looked at him. Each of whom, exactly? Preston did not answer that directly. He instead produced, from somewhere inside his jacket, a very small piece of paper on which he had written 4 names. 3 of them were Veronica, Melanie, and Diane. The 4th was Harriet. Theodore stared at the list for a long time. You can't be serious. It's empirical, Preston said. The terms were simple. Each of the 4 women, all told it was an appreciation gesture from Ashby Capital, framed as a client hospitality initiative, would receive access to a black card for 72 hours. No stated limit, no conditions, no oversight beyond what the account statement would eventually show. They were told only that the gesture was genuine, and that Theodore hoped they'd enjoy themselves. What he did not tell them was that he would be reviewing every transaction. What Preston did not tell Theodore was that he had already guessed, with fairly high confidence, how this would end. Veronica received her envelope on a Wednesday morning. By noon, she had booked a suite at the Hargrove Grand's sister property in Vancouver, arranged a helicopter from a company whose logo she recognized, and texted a friend to say she had, quote, a situation I need to document properly. The friend was a photographer. By Thursday afternoon, her social media had posted 3 times. The captions were thoughtful and vague in the way that expensive experiences often produce. Words like intentional and grateful, appearing alongside photographs of champagne in places with very good light. She also bought a coat. The coat cost $4,000. She referred to it in a caption as an investment piece. She did not spend anything on anyone else. The card, when Theodore reviewed the statement, showed transactions at 2 hotel restaurants, 1 spa, the helicopter company, the photography session, and a boutique in Vancouver that sold things Theodore had never heard of. Total, $41,300. Melanie received her envelope on the same Wednesday. She called the hotel concierge within the hour to ask about their space. She was, she explained, thinking of hosting a small gathering to celebrate a milestone, which milestone exactly she declined to specify, because milestones, she believed, should be felt rather than explained. By Friday morning, she had organized a dinner for 14 people, none of whom were Theodore, and several of whom she introduced, in a subsequent Instagram story, as the people who show up. The dinner cost $8,000. She also bought jewelry. The jewelry was photographed extensively. She donated $300 to a children's hospital and made a separate post about the donation, including a screen grab of the confirmation email. Theodore stared at that screen grab for a while. Total, $26,000. Diane spent the 72 hours more quietly than the others. No social media, no events. She made 4 purchases. A bottle of wine that cost $900, dinner for 2, at a restaurant Theodore recognized as the kind of place you took someone when the conversation needed to go somewhere, and 2 plane tickets to Sedona. The 4th purchase was a real estate database subscription she had wanted for her office. She also sent a handwritten note to Theodore through the hotel concierge, thanking him for his generosity and mentioning, almost as an aside, that she had some thoughts about a property in Bellevue she thought he might find interesting. Total, $11,400. Theodore read all 3 statements on Saturday morning. He sat with them for a while. He felt something, but he wasn't entirely sure what to call it. Then he looked at Harriet's statement. Harriet's statement had 14 line items. He read it twice to make sure he was reading it correctly. The largest single transaction was $612 at a place called Sunridge Supply, which turned out, when Preston looked it up, to be a wholesale supplier of children's furniture and bedding, primarily serving group homes and residential care facilities. The next largest was $428 at a grocery distributor. Then a hardware store, then a paint supplier, then a plant nursery, then a restaurant called Magnolia on 5th. 1 table, 1 person, a meal that cost $47. That last one made Theodore pause. He called Harriet on Saturday afternoon. She picked up on the 2nd ring. "I need to understand your statement," he said. There was a short silence on her end. Not the silence of someone caught. The silence of someone reorganizing their thoughts into the most efficient order. "There's a residential home for kids in foster care on the east side of Capitol Hill," she said. 14 kids ages 5 to 17. The facility director has been trying to get funding for new furniture in 3 of the rooms for 8 months. The current beds are, she paused. "They're not good. You knew about this before the card. I'd been doing some volunteer coordination for them." "Yes. And the paint? The hardware store?" "The rec room needed work. The walls were the color of a waiting room. Another pause. I thought if the kids had to spend time there, they might as well spend it somewhere that looked like someone cared." Theodore stood at his window and looked out at the water. "You spent your own meal," he said. $47. 1 person. I didn't think it would be appropriate to use someone else's money on myself." He waited. "Harriet, yes? That was your budget. It was given to you. You were supposed to use it." "I used it," she said evenly. "I used it on things that needed using it." He didn't have an answer for that. He went to see the home on Monday. He almost didn't. He sat in his car for 4 minutes outside the building. A converted Victorian with a porch swing someone had recently repainted a cheerful yellow, and told himself he was only here because due diligence required it. Then a kid, maybe 7 years old, came out the front door at full speed, clearly chasing something, stopped dead when he saw the car, and said, with the particular gravity of a small child, conveying very important information, "There's a butterfly in the kitchen, and Mrs. Carver says not to touch it, but I'm going to anyway." Then he sprinted back inside. Theodore got out of the car. The director was a woman in her 50s, named Mrs. Carver, who shook his hand with the matter-of-fact warmth of someone who had learned not to waste energy on pretense. She showed him the rooms Harriet had furnished. 3 bedrooms with actual beds, a rec room with yellow walls, a bookshelf in the hallway that was already half full. One of the kids, a 13-year-old named Jordan, who spoke with the authority of someone who had survived a great deal, told Theodore the bookshelf was okay, but they needed more science fiction. Theodore noted this. He wrote a check before he left. A real one from his personal account, not from Ashby Capital. The amount made Mrs. Carver go quiet for a moment. "I'd like to set up a recurring arrangement," he said, "if that's acceptable." Mrs. Carver looked at him with the expression of someone revising a first impression. "It's acceptable," she said. The problem was that Theodore had, in the meantime, managed to make a fairly significant mistake. On Friday, between reading Veronica's statement and calling Harriet, he had run into Diane at the hotel bar. Diane had offered to buy him a drink. This had seemed, in the moment, like a small and harmless thing. Over the course of the drink, Diane had mentioned that she'd had a conversation with someone. She was vague about who had been concerned that Harriet Bloom might not be as straightforward as she seemed. Something about her previous employer, the nonprofit, something about funds. Diane couldn't remember the details exactly. She just thought he should know. Theodore, who prided himself on his judgment, had gone back to his office and spent 2 hours reviewing Harriet's records from her previous employment. He found nothing, but he also, in a moment that he would later classify as one of his less stellar decisions, had sent Harriet a very formal message through Preston, saying that some aspects of her professional history were under review and that she should not make any commitments on behalf of Ashby Capital until further notice. Harriet did not respond. She came to the office on Tuesday morning. Preston, who had read the message and spent the weekend deciding what to do about it, met her in the lobby. He said very little. She said very little. She sat in the small conference room off the main hall and waited. Theodore walked in at 9:15. "I'd like to explain," he started. "You don't have to," she said. "I think I do." She looked at him. She wasn't angry. She was, if anything. "Someone told you something?" she said. "And you believed it without asking me first. She stopped. "That tells me something about how this would work long term." Theodore sat down. He had prepared a very articulate explanation. He found looking at her that most of it no longer seemed useful. "I was wrong," he said instead. "I should have come to you directly." She was quiet for a moment. "Who was it?" she asked. He told her it was Diane. Harriet absorbed this without expression. Then she said, "Did you verify anything she told you?" "Yes," he said. "I found nothing, because there's nothing to find." She picked up her bag. "I left the nonprofit because the funding collapsed. You can confirm that with 2 phone calls. I didn't think it was necessary to pre-defend myself against accusations that hadn't been made yet." She stood up. "Is the review closed?" "It's closed," he said. She nodded once and walked out. Theodore sat alone in the conference room for a while, which he probably deserved. What happened with Veronica, Melanie, and Diane took place over the following 2 weeks, and Theodore did not engineer any of it, which was the thing he was perhaps most proud of in retrospect. Veronica, it emerged, had told several mutual acquaintances about the black card arrangement in enough detail that it became clear she'd assumed it was a precursor to something more personal. When this reached Theodore, via a very uncomfortable phone call from a business associate who thought he should know, he had a direct conversation with her. It was polite. It was brief. It ended with Veronica saying that she had perhaps misjudged the situation, and Theodore agreeing, quietly, that she had. Melanie's dinner for 14 turned out to include 2 venture capital investors, whom she subsequently pitched, during dessert, apparently, for a lifestyle venture she'd been developing. This was discovered when one of the investors, a man named Garrett, who occasionally played golf with Theodore's attorney, mentioned it offhandedly. Theodore did not call Melanie. He simply did not call her again. Diane was more complicated. The story she had told at the bar, the one about Harriet's previous employment, turned out to originate from Diane herself. She had contacted someone who knew someone who had worked at the nonprofit and had asked, specifically, whether there was anything that could raise questions. There wasn't. But the fact that she'd looked became apparent when that someone, uncomfortable with the whole arrangement, mentioned it to Preston. Preston told Theodore. Theodore called Diane. The call lasted 6 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said very clearly what he had found out, and how he had found it out, and that he found it difficult to understand why someone would invest energy in that direction. Diane said she had only been looking out for him. Theodore said he appreciated that framing. Then he said goodbye. He did not hear from her again. There was a moment, a specific, small, slightly ridiculous moment, that Theodore would return to sometimes in the years that followed. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the conference room conversation. He and Harriet were going over the schedule for the following month. She had, at some point in the last few weeks, transformed his calendar from a document that gave Preston anxiety into something that actually resembled a functioning human life, with appropriate gaps between commitments and, notably, 1 Sunday per month blocked off entirely under the label, "Do not schedule." He had asked her about that label. "You need 1 day a month where nothing is required," she said, without looking up from her laptop. "Non-negotiable." "I'm not sure I need you to tell me what I need." "That's fine," she said. The block stays. He had looked at her, this woman with the ink-stained memory and the $47 lunch and the yellow walls in a house on Capitol Hill, and had felt something he was not going to name out loud in a business meeting. Then he stood up too fast, forgot that his coffee was on the arm of his chair, and knocked it directly onto a stack of quarterly reports. Harriet watched the cascade of papers and lukewarm coffee without blinking. "I'll get paper towels," she said. "I'll get them," he said, because he was already at the cabinet and also because he needed 2 seconds. When he turned back around, she was trying very hard not to smile. "Not a word," he said. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said. "You were absolutely going to say something." "I was going to say," she said, with the careful precision of someone choosing every syllable, "that in my professional assessment, the quarterly reports were the least interesting thing on that desk." He looked at her. She looked back. He laughed first. It came out more genuinely than he was prepared for, and she smiled then. A real one, not the careful managed kind he'd gotten used to seeing from people who wanted things from him, and for a moment the office felt like something other than an office. "Harriet," he said when the moment had settled. "Theodore," she said, in the same tone, which meant she was doing it on purpose. "I'd like to take you to dinner. Not as a work thing." She tilted her head slightly. "That would change things." "It would," he agreed. She considered this with the same measured attention she gave everything else. "Somewhere that doesn't have a social media presence," she said finally. "And I'm paying for myself. You're not paying for yourself, Theodore, Harriet." She closed her laptop. "You're going to lose this one." He was already reaching for his phone to make the reservation. "I'm starting to think," he said, "that losing to you might be the most interesting thing that's happened to me in years." The dinner was at a small Italian place in Eastlake that had been there for 30 years and had exactly 2 Yelp reviews, both of which were from the same person and had been written in 2014. The pasta was made in the back by a man named Sal, who came out to greet them because he greeted everyone, and who looked at Theodore with the particular suspicion of someone who had seen a great deal of wealth walk through his door and had learned what usually accompanied it. He looked at Harriet and said she had good posture, which she accepted as the compliment it clearly was. Over dinner, Theodore learned that Harriet had grown up in Tacoma, that her mother had worked 2 jobs and still found time to read aloud every Sunday, that she had almost gone to law school before deciding she wanted to do actual things rather than argue about them, and that she was privately allergic to most fonts used in PowerPoint presentations. Harriet learned that Theodore had grown up in a town in eastern Oregon small enough that everyone knew his business, that he had been the kind of kid who made lists of everything because lists made the world feel manageable, and that he still kept a notebook, a paper one, not digital, in his jacket pocket at all times. She asked to see it. He hesitated. "You can say no," she said. He took it out and slid it across the table. She opened it to the current page. He watched her read whatever was on it. He could not have told anyone in that moment exactly why he'd let her. She closed it and slid it back. "You write things down so you don't have to hold them in your head," she said. "Something like that. That's not a flaw." He picked up his fork. "I didn't say it was. You were about to apologize for it," she said. "Don't." He looked at her. "You notice things," he said. "You pay me to notice things. That's not what I mean." She met his eyes across the table in the candlelight of a restaurant that had been there 30 years and would probably be there 30 more. "I know what you mean," she said quietly. The formal part of it, Theodore calling his attorney. A slight restructuring of the professional arrangement to avoid any suggestion of impropriety. Harriet reviewing a document with the same scrupulousness she brought to everything. Took 2 weeks. Preston, when told, said only obviously, and then returned to whatever he had been doing. Mrs. Carver at the Capitol Hill home, who had become a monthly phone call by this point, listened to Theodore explain the situation and said, "She picked the right things to spend money on. That tells you most of what you need to know about a person." Theodore thought about that for a long time. On a Saturday morning in late October, he drove Harriet to Capitol Hill. She didn't ask where they were going. She sat in the passenger seat and read something on her phone and trusted him to have a reason, which was not something many people did with him and which he found, unexpectedly, moving. When they pulled up to the Victorian with the yellow porch swing, she looked at it for a moment. "You came here," she said. "I came here," he said. "When?" "The Monday after I read your statement." She was quiet for a moment. Through the front window of the house they could see movement. Kids, a Saturday morning, some kind of argument in progress, over a board game that was visible on the living room floor. "Jordan asked for science fiction," Theodore said. "I brought some." He reached into the back seat and produced a paper bag full of books. She stared at the bag, Then she looked at him. "Theodore, I also set up a recurring contribution," he said. "Direct, not through the company. And I talked to Mrs. Carver about the boiler, because apparently that's next." Harriet looked at the bag, then at the house, then at him. Her expression was the kind that takes a moment to arrange itself, because there are too many things happening at once. "You did all of this," she said, "before you knew how things were going to go between us." "I did it because you showed me something that needed doing," he said. "That's not complicated." She shook her head slowly, not in disagreement, more like adjusting. "You're a difficult person to have a straightforward opinion of," she said. "I've been told that," he said. "I'm starting to think it might be a feature," she said. He got out of the car and came around and opened her door. Not because she needed him to, but because some habits, when they mean something, are worth keeping. She took the bag of books. He took her other hand. They walked up the porch steps together, and the door flew open before they could knock. And the 7-year-old who had chased the butterfly on Theodore's first visit came barreling out and stopped and stared at both of them with the unfiltered scrutiny that only small children deploy. "You came back," the kid said to Theodore. "I came back," Theodore agreed. The kid looked at Harriet. "Did you bring cookies?" "Next time," Harriet said, without missing a beat. "Promise?" She looked at the kid with the straightforward warmth of someone who meant what she said and said what she meant. "Promise," she said. The door opened wider. Inside, Jordan was winning the board game, and someone was making something on the stove that smelled like Saturday, and Mrs. Carver was gesturing them both in with the brisk welcome of a woman who had made a life out of making room. Theodore looked at Harriet, standing in the doorway of that house, with the paper bag full of science fiction and a promise already made, and thought, this is what it looks like when someone uses what they're given well. He had been in that doorway before, looking for something, and hadn't known what to call it. He thought now he probably did.